Blah, 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 blah. What? Hello YouTube, I am AC from AC Toy Design. Welcome back. I thought it would just kind of make sense for me to do a video following the mold and the resin casting about how I sculpted the Chud Baby, how I would go about sculpting any figure that I would make. Unfortunately, the sculpting process for Chud Baby came long before I had the inception for the YouTube channel, so there is no documentation of how I did this. However, I feel like I could run you guys through a video detailing the steps that I did take, the tools that I used, and the materials that I used in order to make Chud Baby and to feed Chud Baby and to grow Chud Baby into you're a Chud Baby. The process that I use to sculpt Chud Baby is the same process that I'd go through for any figure that I make. So as I mentioned, I had plans to do this video and show you guys how I sculpted the Chud Baby and what I would go through in order to sculpt anything. But then a good friend of mine reached out and said, I would love to see how you did the Chud Baby. And I said, okay. They say imitation is the mostest form of flattery. So my friend, if you're watching, sit back in the crevice and creases and enjoy. So what we're looking at here is an assortment of my Chud Babies. These are all different colors right up in here. And this one is the original. This is the original sculpt. This one is the original sculpt. Sculpted out of Abe's 2-part epoxy. These folks back here, these are resin casts that I made. Over here we've got the sewer caps that I made. This is the custom one. Man, what's happening here? Alright, it's better. So to start off, I gathered the tools that I was going to use. What I have here is the base that I sculpted it on. This is just an action figure stand. It had a peg. I cut it off and sanded it down. That's why it looks all scratchy and rough. I also have a little bit of water. Now, my favorite tool that I use all the time for everything is my X-Acto knife. My second favorite tool in sculpting comes from a dentist tool set. And this is the sort of like a spear style, something like that. My third favorite tool is one of these. And then I have my silicone shapers. On the reverse, a couple of them have more of those metal rounded things. Now onto the sculpt. I'll show you what I didn't use and what I should have used. I bought some Sculpey. I bought some Sculpey. And I bought some Sculpey. I think the biggest advantage to using Sculpey is that with the Abe's Apoxie that I used, I have a time limit. With this stuff, you can sculpt and then sit it down and come back to it in a day, a week, a month almost, probably more. And it's still soft and malleable until you bake it. So it's much more giving and versatile. Versatile is the word I was looking for. So now here's the stuff that I did use, which I love. I use Abe's Epoxy on almost everything that I do. But the thing with Abe's Epoxy is that you only get a short amount of time before it self-hardens. I've found that the best way to use this stuff is to make shapes, get your rough shapes and your rough details, let it harden, go back and once it's cured after overnight, 12 hours or so, maybe 6 hours at least, and sand, carve, reshape, and then add more of this stuff, add more sculpt to it. I find that Abe's Epoxy sculpt works much better when you're making a custom figure, like this guy. You can see the details that I've added over time, so I sculpt in layers, which is what I did with the Chud Baby, especially with the face. You guys can see the detail in the face. and he's not finished yet, but a lot of the shapes, a lot of the bulk has been done. I wouldn't be able to use Super Sculpey or any kind of clay with a figure like this because the base of him is plastic. And in order to get the Sculpey and the clay to harden, you have to bake it, and you don't want to bake plastic. So let me show you how this stuff works. Abe's Apoxie, it's 2-part. One part, that's B. Another part, that's A. You want equal parts of part A and part B. And I usually just eyeball it. And I'm usually almost always right. At least as far as the clay goes. So there I have 2 parts, A and B. Mix them together. So you mix them together until you get one solid color. No streaks. And it's the same color as the Chud Baby. Well, Chud Baby's a little older, so he's got some grime on him, which is good because that's what Chud Babies do. But it's the same color. Chud Baby. I started with a piece of 2-part epoxy that was just a bit smaller than what you see here. And I made sure it was seamless and mixed right. And then I plopped it down like this on my disc, my action figure stand that's roughed up. A lot of people use cork or wood because if you're using a clay that bakes, you want to use something that isn't going to melt. When I started and I had my piece on here and I had the Chud Baby stuck right there, and what the platform does is it allows you to hold it rather than holding the piece that you're sculpting, because I guarantee you I do this every time. I'll sculpt something, turn it around, stick my thumb in it, and I've ruined what I sculpted. So if you have a platform, that's what you hold, and the Abe's Epoxy or the clay that you're using, will stick to it. And again, if it's something you're going to bake, don't use plastic. So once I had my base shape, which was very similar to this, sort of the egg shape with no features. Once I had that, then I took more epoxy, and it was cured. I took more epoxy and I would shape it into a leg, like so. Give it a good shape, sculpt some details onto it. Come over here, shape another leg, sculpt some details onto it. And what I was using to sculpt were my tools that I showed you. I used this guy a lot to get in here, make little marks, do little things, little do's, little crevices and creases. My silicone tools with the silicone tips, they're very bendy, and that's where my water would come in. The water gives it a little bit of a slickety feel, so that it doesn't drag the sculpt or drag the clay and ruin your details that you're making. And I could get in here and do little, almost like a paintbrush on your canvas. So this chunk of clay that I'm working, or epoxy or clay that I'm working with, is my canvas. What was I about to say? I don't even know. It's a weird word. So on your canvas, I'm adding shapes. Once the leg, and I got the details of the leg cured, 6 hours, 8 hours overnight. I usually let it sit overnight and I go to another project and work on it. But I would come back and I would shape an arm, okay? And then with the arm, I would get in here in the little do's and like make my little divots with some of these tools, make little divots and stuff. Get my little lines, age them up, roughen them up a little bit. Come over here and do the other arm. Then I'd let that sit overnight and let that cure. And so on and so on. I think the last thing that I did was the teeth, because I had to get the lips, and then I sort of implanted the teeth, and I would get the shape, sculpted them out. The ears were added just like the arms and legs. The eyes, I made divots and then sculpted the eyes, made a little ball with the epoxy. Okay, rounded out a little ball, and then had the socket already made. Put the little eyeball in there, let it cure, and then I'd slowly just build the details around the pronounced details, like the eye or the ear. I'd build the brow, and I'd build the nose and get the nostrils, get the details. And I sculpted it in layers, layers and layers and layers. Just remember, when you're using Aves, you get about an hour at most to shape and sculpt before it gets too hard. With the clay, you can come back to it time and time again. The only disadvantage of that is that since it's not hard, you have to be careful when you pick it up to not mush anything that you've sculpted. But the next time I do something like this, I will probably use clay, because I can sculpt stuff, come back to it, and then if I'm not happy with some of the details, I can get back in there. Another thing that's very important to keep in mind, once you do have the basic figure, you think you're happy with it, you want to come in with some sandpaper. Okay, I use two. I think this is the 100 medium, and I think this is the fine, this 220. You can buy all the different kinds of grits. Just make sure you have a big one and a small, and like a chunky one and a fine one. And I went over and shaped things that I needed to shape and smoothed things out that I needed to smooth out. But beyond that, I really like to use my X-Acto knife, and be careful because they're sharp, to come in and sort of scrape. If I found a thumbprint or a fingerprint on there that obviously you didn't want, I could scrape it away. Okay, just like that. If I wanted to get a little bit more detail in his ear, between his ear and his head, I could come in there and scrape that away. And just give it all around, just kind of tighten up the sculpt. Also, with the tightening of the sculpt, in between crevices and creases, arm, his legs, anywhere where there's a pronounced feature, his eyes, sometimes you might see gaps, and if it's something that you're gonna resin cast, you don't want those gaps, so I would take more epoxy, because the gaps can fill with air, create a bubble, it's a mess. So I would take more epoxy and I'd apply it in here, dip it in my water, and then come and smooth this out and make sure that it's seamless and flawless. Now once that's dried, you might look at it and be like, oh, there's too much in there. So that's when I come in and I get a little scrape going on, and just kind of tighten up the sculpt. And also, don't be afraid if you do accidentally chop something off and you're like, oh, ruin that. You can always come back in with some more sculpt, add it to it, smooth it out, blend it in, and then reshape it and redefine it. I use this also with the teeth to make them more pronounced, and get in there and floss his teeth so he doesn't have all that bad breath and weird stuff going on that chud babies do. Once he was done, once I felt like he was done, I think one of my techniques, and what I think is very important is to set him down on his little thing and let him sit for a day, and look at him and look at him, and then don't look at him, and then look at him some more, and then don't look at him some more. But what that's going to do is get your brain to thinking, well, is there anything am I happy with it? Is there anything I need to add? Is there anything I need to take away? And even though this arm is extremely hard, it's like a rock, this Aves epoxy hardens to like a rock. Even though that's hard like a rock, when I first started my chud baby, I had his arms and his legs and a bunch of features on him, and I was not happy. So I went to town with my Dremel and just Dremeled the whole thing down again into like an egg shape. I wasn't happy with it, so I started over. I didn't want to waste the clay, I didn't want to waste the epoxy. And I wanted to keep it, it was a good base. So I just Dremeled it down, sanded it down, and then reapplied a new arm, a new leg, a new eye, whatever it was that I ended up shaving off, until I was happy with it. That's where you get into the differences between the epoxy and the clay, is that if it was clay, I could just peel it off, I wouldn't have to Dremel it and get the dust and the mess. But I am glad that I used the epoxy. I do like Aves a lot. I probably won't be using it for a solid minifigure or another MABA figure. Aves is more of adding to a figure, whereas the clay is designed to build the figure from scratch, from the ground up. So start with your clay, your base, your canvas, and just build on it like a painting. You're gonna build an arm, you're gonna build a leg, an eye, lips, everything. And just do it in layers. And then when each layer is hardened, you add to it. And just remember, you can always take away. Just don't take away my chud baby. So I hope you guys found the video at least a little bit helpful. I hope that it helped to understand the process that I go through with sculpting, the materials that I use, and the tools that I use. If it wasn't helpful, maybe I should just shave my beard. What? If it was helpful, let me know in the comments down below. Be sure to like, subscribe, and bell icon. I don't know. Check out my podcast, You Like Toys, on Anchor and Spotify. And if you'd like to help the channel grow, check out my Patreon at patreon.com/actoydesign. That link and affiliate links for all the stuff that I used are below, along with others. And I will see you folks in the future.